Welcome back to another edition of the Draft Dynasty Podcast. My name is Jeremy Betts, and I'm joined on this episode of the show by Archie Wilson. Archie joining me again. We're going to talk some fantasy football. Excited to do so with my good buddy, new buddy, Archie Wilson here on the show. How you doing, Archie?
Good bits, looking forward to it. Second time on the show. Excited to get into the topics that we've been talking about just before. So ready to talk some ball.
Yeah, man. Yeah, we are. And we're going to talk some more fantasy. We're going to do some buy or sell. And I think that this is going to be a lot of fun. Buying or selling big name fantasy faces in new places. That's the title of the episode. And I just kind of wanted to hit this because a lot of times when you look at the fantasy landscape, you're just kind of running straight rankings and you're looking at maybe some of the guys who are sleepers or maybe change of role or something like that. But we don't often just sit back and hit the guys who are in new spots. And I think that this is going to be fun because there's some big names out there that have, and there's also, we were just looking through it pre-show, not a lot of specific positions either where there were a lot of change-ups. We were looking at running back, and there's not really any changes at running back outside of a couple worth noting. And then you have the rookies obviously stepping in, and we'll hit a few rookies in this episode, but most of this is going to be guys who were on rosters in 2024, moving on to new places in 2025, and how that impacts their value and what they are going to be able to provide for you as a fantasy asset in 2025. So Archie, let's just start off at the top here with the quarterbacks. And I think maybe the guy that intrigues me the most, and we'll get to whether we're buying or selling what he looks like, but that guy is Justin Fields to me, moving from Pittsburgh, where he was given 6 games while Russell Wilson was hurt, and showed, for a couple of those weeks, why he's such a valuable fantasy asset at quarterback when he's given the reins as the starter. Now he goes to New York, and there's nobody pushing him for snaps. He's going to be the starter there all year unless he gets hurt. And I think this is a really good situation. So how are we feeling about Justin Fields in New York and his stock for 2025 as a fantasy quarterback?
Yeah, I think for Justin, his stock has to have gone up from what it was this time last year. I mean, he got 6 opportunities to show the talent that we kind of all knew that he had, and he definitely did show a lot of glimpses and maybe more consistent glimpses to what he had throughout his time in Chicago. So personally, obviously, I watched a lot of Steelers, so I saw those first 6 games of Justin to start out the season, and I was reasonably encouraged from the way he was playing. So from a from a fantasy perspective, he fits the mold of the new quarterback of what you're looking for, with being able to create plays out of structure, make chunk plays as we saw him do with the Steelers, then also use his legs. So I think him moving to the Jets and being given the full reins, not having to look over his shoulder for Russell Wilson coming back, and just being able to focus in week after week being that starter, I think will only benefit him as the season goes on. And especially with the new setup they've got in the Jets, it does seem like potentially it will be a slightly better ecosystem for a player and a quarterback, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And when you look at his skill set and what the Jets have kind of been able to build this offseason and last really too, when it comes to playmakers, they've got weapons on the outside, specifically Garrett Wilson. They lose Devontae Adams this year, and we'll get to Devontae Adams a little bit later in the show, but you still have to kind of like what they've done at offensive line with adding some youth there. And Breece Hall is a great running back. Braylon Allen's a good second piece in the backfield there. This offense is kind of built around Justin Fields' skill set, where I think he's going to run the football a lot. So I'm definitely buying this one. Like I'm buying the fact that he's going to have improved his fantasy stock in 2025. So I definitely agree with you there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, as you mentioned with Garrett Wilson, an underrated part of it is that the Ohio State connection as well. So there's a relationship there as well with his number one guy. And we saw, even though George Pickens had better numbers with Russell Wilson, there was still definitely a reliance on his number one guy. And
Mhm.
so that being a familiar face is an intriguing prospect for sure.
Absolutely. All right, let's move on to a I guess two teams that I think if you want to call it a quarterback swap, you can. Not necessarily because the Seattle Seahawks didn't send a quarterback back to the Vikings for this, but I like to think of these two teams in cohesion here from this type of perspective, and that's JJ McCarthy now is the starting quarterback for the Minnesota Vikings. It's not a new place for him, but he's a new starter,
Hmm.
and he's coming off of a lost year as a rookie due to
Yeah.
injury. And so I think we can hit his prospects here. And then in correlation to that, Sam Darnold going to Seattle. What does that look like, right? Um, so if you had to pick these two guys, are you buying or selling either one?
If there was a middle option, I'd take that on JJ just
Yeah.
because
Okay.
and not a lot has changed for me from when he came out of college. Like, I guess he's had a year of sitting in meetings, which is valuable, but
Mhm.
he didn't necessarily get a whole lot of time to be out on the field and work throughout the season like a rookie normally would if they get given the opportunity to sit for a year. That wasn't the exact same for him because he obviously wasn't fit for it. Um, he's obviously still got Justin Jefferson on the outside, got Aaron Jones at
Mhm.
running back, got one of the better head coaches and offensive minds in the league in Kevin O'Connell. So ecosystem's a big word for fantasy, and he's got a good one, a
Yep.
great one, some would say. And then on the other side, Sam Darnold's leaving that great ecosystem and moving
Yeah.
into something that might not be quite as that's not going to optimize his skill set as good potentially, and maybe not bail him out as much. Because don't get me wrong, he played good football last year, but he certainly wasn't perfect, or I don't know if he was this $40 million quarterback that we saw outside of Minnesota, if you get what I mean there, or
Yeah.
30 million quarterback, whatever contract he got. And I think it's an interesting offense because your two main guys being JSN and Cooper Cup now, they're two slots. There's no longer that dominant outside guy that Seattle have been so used to with DK Metcalf. So it'll be
Mhm.
interesting. Obviously, Sam Darnold kind of made his hay last year with Justin Jefferson, who could win at all different levels and especially deep. So him relying on two slots will be intriguing for sure.
Yeah, it is, and I agree with you. It's kind of a push on McCarthy because we don't know. We don't know what he doesn't have any priors to go off of when it comes to production for fantasy. But I do think when you talk about the ecosystem, you're talking about a guy maybe stepping into the best situation a rookie quarterback or a first year starting quarterback could when it comes to play caller, schematics, and then the weapons out there. Jordan Addison is as good a wide receiver too as there is in
Mhm.
the league when you're talking about productive guys who can handle large workloads. Justin Jefferson, obviously, there. Maybe TJ Hawkinson's a little bit more healthy this year. I like Aaron Jones out of the backfield there as well when you're talking about guys you can dip the ball to. And we know JJ likes to check it down from his days at Michigan, and not in a bad way either. Like he knows when to do it. So I think that he's going to have a chance to be very viable this year. Sam Darnold was the number 9 quarterback in fantasy points last year in
Okay.
2024 for the Vikings. So I'm totally selling this that he would be better in Seattle. Um, could he be a viable like QB2? Sure. If you're in a super flex league, he has a lot of value, but I'm not buying him early in drafts because of what he was last year. While I still think that like Clint Kubiak's going to do a good job over there, and that offense is going to be decent overall, it's gonna rely on that running game a lot with Kenneth Walker and um, I always forget the
Charbonnet.
yeah Charbonnet. That's right. Uh,
Yeah.
It's gonna rely on the running game, but you do have two good weapons there now in Jackson Smith and Jigba and Cooper Cup. So he's gonna be viable. But to say he's gonna be better than last year or it's a better situation for him, I think would would just be false. So selling that one, and then it's a push on McCarthy for me right now. The other quarterback who swapped teams here as part of Sam Darnold coming to Seattle, the reason they needed a quarterback was because they traded Geno Smith to the Raiders. And Geno Smith on the Raiders is fascinating to me because I really like
Mhm.
Geno. I think that he's a good NFL quarterback. I think he's a top 12 NFL quarterback. And now you drop him on a Raiders team that, you know, the wide receiver room might not seem incredible, but I think you got Brock Bowers there, and now you've got Ashton Genty. A lot of ways to get the ball out to playmakers and let them do work. I think Geno could have himself a good year. So maybe this is a push as well, but I think I'm gonna buy um Geno Smith as a viable fantasy quarterback in Las Vegas to the same degree that he was last year and in Seattle, and maybe even a little bit better. That Shane Waldron Seattle offense last year was kind of a mess, and Geno was still pretty decent. I think it's a little bit better situation in Las Vegas, honestly.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. I definitely sit in a similar area regarding Gino as you kind of just described their bets. I think one of the keys is that he's going into a system that's going to be relatively familiar to him. He's obviously spent a lot of time with Pete Carroll in the past, so going into Vegas, he's going to know how to run the offense that Pete Carroll likes, even if he wasn't the starter under Carroll for a long time. And I think, as you kind of alluded to, there might not be supreme outside talent, but Jacoby Myers is a wide receiver too, in his own right, and then
Mm-hmm.
Brock Bowers is that much of a game changer that
Mm-hmm.
even though he's a tight end, he's good enough to be your playmaker one or your wide receiver one de facto in a way. So I
Mm-hmm.
think having Bowers, Myers, and then obviously adding Ashton Genty, there's a lot of talent surrounding him, plus that familiarity with Pete Carroll, and I think that Raiders are one of those teams that I can see taking a good step next year, especially with all the changes they've made as a franchise. So I think buying into the Geno Smith as a player and then the Raiders as well kind of work together there. So I think buying Geno is a smart option.
Yeah, and maybe this year one with all that coming together, maybe that's not the best year of it, but year two I think could be really dynamic. If you have a chance to get Geno Smith cheap in your dynasty league, and you're trying to maybe like build for next year, 2026 or something like that, he could be an option for you, for that, and maybe you get some other assets around him. Aaron Rodgers is the news story of the weekend here, signing with the Pittsburgh Steelers officially. What does that look like? Are you buying Rodgers in Pittsburgh as a viable fantasy quarterback? And I don't even mean like a starter, like you're going to start him every week or anything like that. But does this look better for Rodgers than it did with the Jets last year?
I'd say it'd be pretty hard to not be like last year and the years, even though statistically he was good or like fine as a quarterback. I think
Mm-hmm.
he's going to be in an environment and a team that is better, just flat out better at the Steelers. I think even though he's not going to have the George Pickens and DK Metcalf tandem that was kind of looked at the start of the offseason, I think you've still got a bit of a wash potentially in the wide receiver room. I think what the Steelers have got going on the offensive line and the running game is also
Mm-hmm.
exciting. So I think back to that ecosystem talk, I think potentially you've got a slight uptick there. And just because last year what he was dealing with, and even though he might have been a part of it slightly or quite a
Yeah.
bit, in terms of the dumpster fire that the Jets were, I
Yeah.
think he's going to have a lot more. He's going to be able to focus a lot more on his play on the field rather than everything that's going on around him and things like that. It'll be a lot more smooth. So I think, as you said, you might not even have him as a QB2, but I think
Mm-hmm.
as a bench option, he's definitely a guy that's going to put together a few good performances. And if you can strike luck by starting him in
Mm-hmm.
one of those games, then you might see a bit of vintage A Rod at some stage through the season.
Yeah, he'll be one of those boomer bust streamers on like bye weeks where if you get him in the right matchup, then he could go off. If if you're looking at it from just a talent around him perspective on offense, maybe it's not quite as electric um, a combination of playmakers that the Jets had last year, but that totally offsets to me with that ecosystem talk, like you're referencing there, and the fact that it's going to be so much more stable, and the Steelers structurally are way more sound across the board than the Jets were. A lot of the problems with Aaron Rodgers last year or the last 2 years in New York were because he was enabled to do so by an organization that was desperate for some kind of savior on offense, some kind of savior
Yeah.
at quarterback, and they were like, just hand Rodgers the keys and see what he can build for us. And it's just not the way to do it with these big ego quarterbacks. And I'm not saying that in a derogatory way necessarily. All the best quarterbacks in the league have big egos. I mean, Ben Roethlisberger did,
Mhm.
Tom Brady did.
Yeah.
They felt they knew best, and in a lot of cases they were right. But sometimes it doesn't work out. And for Aaron Rodgers, it didn't work out last year. I think it works out okay in Pittsburgh, and
Yeah.
I think he will be a viable streamer throughout the season. DK Metcalf is a good player, and Pat Freiermuth is a good player in the middle of the field. I think Aaron Rodgers is going to utilize him there, and the Steelers probably aren't done adding to that pass catching room anyway. And I like the Steelers pass catching options out of the backfield a lot. Caleb Johnson, rookie, and Jalen Warren has proven to be a very good pass catcher out of the backfield. So maybe Arthur Smith can dial up something special this year with Rodgers under center. It's not the best coordinator to quarterback fit in the world, but it's more functional than I think either quarterback with Arthur Smith was last year for the Steelers. So I'll buy this one for sure at the quarterback spot.
Yeah.
Any other quarterbacks we need to hit? I don't think so necessarily, unless you want to talk Cam Ward a little bit, but that's a rookie. We can get into rookie conversations later. I think he'll be viable, but I just, again, no context for him as a fantasy player, so it's hard to dive into
Yeah,
buying or selling.
exactly. Yeah.
So,
And
okay.
obviously he
Yeah,
was even that he was a raw prospect in itself. So not super raw, but definitely has a lot to work on before he becomes an out and out
yeah,
QB 1 or 2 in fantasy. So there's just a lot of unknown. So I agree there.
absolutely. All right, we're going to go ahead and take a break. The quarterbacks took up a large portion of the discussion. The wide receivers will as well, but not so much running backs and tight ends. So we're going to go ahead and take our break now. Don't go anywhere. The Draft Dynasty Podcast will be right back. And welcome back to the Draft Dynasty Podcast. It's Jeremy Betts and Archie Wilson coming to you, talking some of the big name fantasy faces in new places we're buying or selling, whether they're going to be good for fantasy, better situations than they had last year. Let's move on to running backs. We talked about the quarterbacks in the first half. The running backs, Archie, we were looking through it pre-show, and it's really surprising. There's not a lot new happening on the running back side of things. Everybody's kind of returning there, with a couple exceptions, and maybe an exception to our rule of thumb for how we're designing this show that we'll talk about here. But Najee Harris is kind of the big name who was a starter last year for another team that's going to end up being on a different roster. And now he's got competition from a rookie. And we dived into the rookies really deep last week on the show, or a couple weeks ago on the show. So go back and listen to that if you want anything on the rookies. But for Najee Harris specifically, is there any way you can paint this in a good light for him fantasy wise? I think I have to sell his fantasy prospects on the Chargers with Amari and Hampton there.
Yeah, absolutely. So for Najee, he's gone from being the guaranteed workhorse back in a way because you knew Mike Tomlin was a big fan of him and the way that he
Yep.
ran the ball. And I think this offseason has been pretty dim for Najee. I think he didn't get the contract value that potentially was thought he might get, was thought that he could get on the market prior to free agency. And all those details are quite big because the more money that teams have invested in players, the more opportunities they're going to get on the field. So the size of his contract and then partnering that with them, the Chargers, adding a running back in the first round in Amari and Hampton definitely takes away a lot of potential touches for Najee going into this year. So I think it's definitely a sell for Najee. I mean, I enjoyed what he did for the Steelers as a Steeler fan, but it was definitely time to move on. And I think he's definitely moving into more of a reduced role going ahead for the Chargers.
Yeah, I agree with that. Let's talk a little bit about Javonte Williams in Dallas. He kind of feels like their lead back right now, because they didn't make a move there. And coming out of Denver, where he was injured a lot and just never could find his footing as a viable fantasy running back for more than a couple week spurts at a time. Do you like him better in Dallas behind that offensive line at all? I think maybe I do slightly, but this might be a push for me as well. I don't know if I'm ready to jump on this train in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah, I do know a lot of people have been valuing Javonte slightly higher this year. I think it has a lot to do with the fresh start that he's got, moving to Dallas. And I think, yeah, as you said, he's definitely looking like the RB1 to start off the season. But I will say the injuries are worrisome, so you can't guarantee he's going to be fit for a lot of the year. And then alongside that, there's always going to be, since he's not got a huge investment in him, there's going to be opportunities for people below him that we're not quite aware of, or that the Cowboys weren't expecting to take on a bigger role to do so. If that makes sense, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it does. He's a soft buy for me if I'm gonna go one way or the other. Like, I'll buy it, but not before very close to the end of my draft.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
he'd have to be really good value at some point there. I wanted to talk about DeAndre Swift. Not because he's new in Chicago, but because Ben Johnson's coming to Chicago as the head coach and obviously the play caller and everything from his stint in Detroit, where that running game in Detroit was just, it was the best in the league every year that he was there, except for maybe the year that DeAndre Swift was also there. So how do we feel about this? I think it's worth mentioning because, I mean, DeAndre Swift is locked into a huge workload over there unless they make another move. So do we believe in him with Ben Johnson there, even though we've seen it before in Detroit? Do we believe that there's a chance he could have a good fantasy season, a better fantasy year than last year, specifically with Ben Johnson there calling the plays?
Yeah, so I think if he does end up getting a similar workload to what he did last year, I think it would be pretty difficult to not have a better season running in a scheme called by Ben Johnson, who, as you
Yeah.
said, has conducted the most prolific running offense of the last 2, 3 years since being in the Lions. So I think when it comes to Swift, you can also look at their relationship in two ways. One, you could say that it's a positive because they've got a relationship and they know each other. They've spent a season with each other. So there might be a certain level of trust there that Ben Johnson might not have with other running backs. But on the flip side of that is we saw Swift get phased out of Detroit as Johnson kind of got further into his tenure. Obviously, he only had 1 year with DeAndre, so there could be maybe a lack of trust in a way. So there's definitely two arguments to that
Yeah.
kind of point. So I think you'd probably struggle to not say, similar to Javonte, a soft buy,
Yeah.
just because playing in a prolific scheme and in a, back to that same word, ecosystem that I expect to take
Mm-hmm.
a step forward, or if not a major step forward this year from what it was last year. I think it'd be maybe pretty tough to not buy.
Yeah, yeah, I agree with that. And I wanted to clarify something too. I made a mistake earlier. I said Shane Waldron was the Seattle Seahawks offensive coordinator. In 2024, he was the Bears offensive coordinator in 2024. Ryan Grubb was calling the plays for Seattle. So my mistake there. I was thinking about that afterwards. I was like, that doesn't sound quite right, and I realized where my mistake was. But either way, a big jump for DeAndre Swift as far as like schematic advantage for a running game, now that Ben Johnson is there. So yeah, I agree. Talent wise, maybe you wouldn't give him much of a leg up, but scheme wise, I think you do. So that soft buy phrase, if you will, is appropriate, I think, for this call as well. Let's get to the wide receivers because I think that this is where you can get really creative with some stuff here. Let's talk about Devontae Adams first. Going from the Jets and the dysfunction there, but still putting up 1,000 yards on 80 plus receptions with Aaron Rodgers as his quarterback. So a guy he knew, though, that plays into this. He now goes to the Rams. Matthew Stafford's just as good, if not better, at this point in his career of a quarterback as Aaron Rodgers has been. And he's got a good running mate there, Puka Nacua. Right now, how much does Puka Nacua eat into what Davante Adams is going to get target share wise? Does that make this less of a good situation than it was last year for Davante Adams? I don't know. I kind of feel like that Stafford-led McVay offense is going to just throw the ball a ton to these guys.
Yeah.
So I think I'm buying this one. I like Davante Adams still. I think we could look up mid-season and be like, is this guy 26 again? I think he's having a really good year. And, you know, he's going to be a guy that everybody's trying to trade for, or maybe you're trying to sell high on him while things are going well. So what do you think, though? Do you kind of agree with that, or are you selling this because of maybe Nacua taking more of a larger workload share than maybe what Davante Adams was having to share in New York?
Yeah, so I think you kind of look at four factors when it comes to a wide receiver and when they're moving. So I think you look at the quality of the quarterback, the coach and the play caller, the target share, like you mentioned, and then talking about is his talent still there? And I think for three of those elements there, um, you see Devontae, he's still the same. Maybe not 100% of what he was at Green Bay, but he's still 85% there, and that's still a top 15, 20 wide receiver at minimum. He can still run routes. He's still got great hands. So that's not a question for me. And then you think about the quarterback, I would tend to agree that Stafford is a step above Aaron or Rodgers at this point of his career. So that's another tick. And then moving into Sean McVay's offense is one of probably the best ecosystems to be from a schematic standpoint for wide receivers. He's able to scheme you up touches. You could get the ball from the slot. I mean, you saw Cooper Cup turn into a triple crown winner under McVay, and he's probably not a triple crown level talent, but having McVay calling up the plays, it just makes things so much easier for playmakers. So that's three like bold ticks for me in terms of those four factors. And when you're talking about target share, I think your justification of it was spot on. I mean, Nakua's the number one there, but you saw Cooper Cup was able to get touches as well when he was healthy, even with Puka there still. So they were both able to get theirs, and I think Devontae's another step or two above what Cooper Cup is now. So I'm not too worried about the target share. So he's a definite buy for me.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's talk about another Steeler. We talked about Aaron Rodgers. Let's talk about DK Metcalf coming over from Seattle in a trade, and then the Steelers moved on from George Pickens. So the target share issue shouldn't be a huge deal for DK. He's clearly the number one receiver in Pittsburgh. You have to like now that Aaron Rodgers is officially signed. You have to like the quarterback situation for DK better. Than we thought it was going to be with Mason Rudolph, if that was how things ended up. Now, is it better than it was with Geno in Seattle last year? That's the big question here. So, Archie, are you buying or selling DK Metcalf in new clothes in 2025 from a fantasy perspective?
Yeah, it's interesting again. I think this one could be another push, just because he's going to get a tremendous target share unless something else happens in the wide receiver room. He's the clear cut number one. I think Geno was or is a better quarterback than what Aaron Rodgers is right now. So even
Yep.
with the addition of Aaron Rodgers, I think the quarterback situation in Seattle was clear cut better by a tier or even two. Um, and then regarding the one thing I did want to say about the fit for DK is that we know that Rodgers loves to throw quick go balls and slants. So that those are his 2
Mm-hmm.
main routes he likes to throw to, and that's kind of where DK makes his hay. So the
Yeah.
fit from a fit standpoint, I think that will be encouraging, and target share once again encouraging. But I just think there's another step down from what the quality of quarterback play was for DK last year. So I think with all those factors aligned, it's just a bit of a push for me. But then I suppose the other thing you've got to think is that the Steelers invested a astronomical contract into DK. So
Yeah.
I've heard a lot. They must be thinking potentially they can get more out of DK than what Seattle could, because he
Mm-hmm.
probably wasn't that $30 million wide receiver from a market value standpoint in Seattle, he might have been more like 27 or 26. So I think potentially the coaching staff in Pittsburgh think that they can get more out of him.
Yeah, that very well could be possible. And I mean, I look at when you look at like the fantasy pros, they kind of give you a 1 to 5 star grade based on your projected strength of schedule at that position. And DK Metcalf has one of the better strength of schedules. He's got a 4-star strength of schedule. So I think that, you're talking about a guy who, from a matchup based perspective, he's looking at softer coverages mostly. He can kind of eat those up. But, when I take the black and gold glasses off as a Steeler fan and just look at this objectively, it's hard for me to imagine a scenario where DK Metcalf is better or in a better situation. Let me put it that way. Is in a better situation than he was last year. Even with the target share being probably enormous here, there is a degree where you want a guy who can steal some of the coverage away from your superstar player. And, Jackson Smith and Jigba for Seattle last year was that guy. And he kind of ended up establishing himself as the wide receiver one and maybe the future at the wide receiver position for what Seattle was trying to do, which made DK expendable, and they didn't want to pay him that much money, and Pittsburgh was willing to. So this one is really difficult. It really is. I think that there's a chance DK Metcalf is better just because he's paid, he's being treated like a wide receiver one, and he's going to get such a large target share. But I also think that there's a world where the quarterback situation is just not nearly as good. And because you have a quarterback that is not as good throwing you the football, that things go downhill and don't look as good. So based on where he finished last year, I think there's a reasonable shot that he has a better overall season. But still, I think I'm with you where I'm just kind of pushing this and waiting to see what happens a little bit before I dive one way or the other. If I had to lean one direction, though, I'm selling it very, very softly at this point as an upgraded situation for DK. So that's kind of where I land with it. Let's go with the guy next that the Steelers traded away, George Pickens to Dallas. This is a really interesting one because George Pickens, as talented as he was, he really couldn't break out in Pittsburgh this last year the way we thought maybe he could, because teams were just boxing him in coverage all day. They didn't have anybody else to worry about. And now you've got CeeDee Lamb over there who, yeah, he's going to take most of the targets, but could George Pickens be a little bit more efficient in Dallas in this situation with better quarterback play and with a team that where he doesn't have the pressure of being the number one receiver? I think that's very possible. In fact, I'm probably buying his stock a little bit more. Right now he's wide receiver 34 by ADP on Fantasy Pros. I think he outperforms that pretty easily in 2025.
Yeah, I think it's kind of similar again to that Devontae Adams discussion that we had, where they're stepping into a role where they're clearly wide receiver 2 now, but just being in a system like the Cowboys, they throw the ball plenty, a lot more than a lot of other teams do, especially with their lack of running back talent as well. Rely on Dak and his arm and how he can take them through a game. So I think, once again, you're looking back at the quarterbacks. Dak's a better quarterback than Russell Wilson and Justin Fields were last year. I think for GP, the good thing is, as you said, he's probably going to get a lot more one-on-one coverage than he was seeing last year in Pittsburgh when, yeah, he was double covered basically the whole game. So I think efficiency, and I think even though he's going to have maybe a smaller target share, the volume could match up or just be slightly less, just because there's going to be a lot more throws in that offense, a lot more balls thrown. So from that standpoint, there's going to be still a good amount of opportunity for GP to make plays and score touchdowns, and
Yeah, all of the above.
yeah.
Let's see here. How about let's talk about Deebo Samuel and Cooper Kupp, two veteran players, a little bit older now. They're going to new spots. Deebo Samuel's going to Washington. playing with second-year quarterback Jaden Daniels, coming off of a rookie of the year type performance. Just incredible first season for Jaden Daniels. And then Cooper Kupp, he's now getting passes thrown to him by Sam Darnold in Seattle. He's running with JSN there. How do we feel about these two guys? I think Deebo Samuel, I'm selling just on principle because I think that San Francisco offense was the best scenario for him ever. And even with Jane Daniels probably being a better quarterback in the end than Brock Purdy, I think schematically what not Sean McVay, Kyle Shanahan was able to put together for Deebo Samuel, and now the injury history and the age for Deebo, I think he's run his course as a viable fantasy asset, and I don't think I can buy him there. Cooper Kupp, on the other hand, I could see a little bit of a resurgence in a new system and not being in the shadow of Puka Nacua now, which it really turned over when Cooper Kupp got hurt and Nacua stepped into the big role 2 years ago as a rookie, and then it was over from there. So, but Cooper Kupp now in Seattle, this is a straight up push for me. I think that situation wise, he's probably in a little bit better situation, but he is a year older. And JSN's the one there, if you will, 1A, and Cooper Kupp's going to be the 1B. So I don't really love either one for fantasy, but as it stands, I'm probably buying Cooper Kupp more than I would buy Deebo Samuel pretty easily here.
Yeah, so I'm a pretty heavy sell on Debo. I think his health is worrying. Moving from the San Francisco scheme, like you said, is another huge worry. Even though it is another high-powered offense and a very efficient offense that Washington was able to put on show last year, conducted by Jane Daniels, I think there's definitely going to be regression, and that's just he relied so heavily on his athleticism early in his career, which he was an elite athlete in so many different ways, but with injuries and aging, I just don't see him producing, and I think it's just going to be maybe a slow downhill from here for Debo from a fantasy standpoint. Doesn't mean he's not going to make some vintage Debo plays, but I just think from an overall fantasy standpoint, there's going to be regression there. And then from Cooper Kupp's standpoint, I think it's interesting because we'll find out if he really was just a scheme player for McVay. I mean, obviously he had a lot of talent, but stepping away from Sean McVay, who's been the only head coach he's played for, I believe, and someone that's optimized his skill set probably the most it could have possibly been, will be interesting to see in another year. And like Debo, another year of age, and also he's had a lot of injury issues recently. I think we could see some issues there. The fit with Jason, obviously they're both slot players predominantly. You'd see a lot of them line up in the slot. So I think JSN's going to obviously be the guy that is amplified in that offense, and they want to optimize his skill set, and that is from the slot. So I'm probably a soft sell on Cooper Kupp more so. So a heavier sell on Debo and a softer sell on Cooper Kupp.
I like it. I'm probably steering clear of both of those guys in my drafts, honestly. So
absolutely.
Do with them what you will if you're willing to take that chance. But for me, I think I'm out on both of those guys. You wanted to hit the rookies, a couple of them real quick, mostly Travis Hunter, because it sounds like he's going to be a wide receiver first over there in Jacksonville, and then maybe rotate in at corner, depending on how they want to use him there. But how do you feel about Travis Hunter? And then talk a little bit about Tech McMillan there too for Carolina in that situation. How do you feel about those guys? And they're new faces in a new place, but it's rookie wide receivers. So what are our expectations for those guys? Are you buying or selling their situations?
Well, I think from when Travis was drafted, you've got to buy now just because of the information that we've been provided that he's majoring in offense for the Jags. So we weren't sure when he got drafted if they were going to have him be a cornerback first and wide receiver second in sub packages, but now we know that he's going to be out on the field for majority of the offensive snaps and be out there every now and again on defense. I think you've only got one option, and that is to buy. And to me, he is clearly the best wide receiver in the draft. He's a great route runner. And I think the thing that makes him so special as a player, obviously he's a great athlete, but the way he can track the ball and his ball skills, I think that's some of the best I've ever seen, and I think a lot of people have ever seen. So I think I'm
Mhm.
buying Travis. And then regarding Tet, I wasn't overly high on Tet coming out. I struggle to see the separation ability. I mean, obviously he's got a lot of good physical tools, but the speed and
Mhm.
separation does worry me. But from a ecosystem standpoint, I liked what I saw from Bryce Young towards the end of last season. And I think him getting the reins completely this year, I assume they're not going to have those question marks with Bryce. And I'm
Mhm.
expecting him to take another step forward from what we saw in whatever the last 6 games or last quarter of last season. So I think for Tet, he's probably going to be the number one. I know they invested in Leggett last year with a late first rounder, but there's a big
Mhm.
difference in a number
Mhm.
32 or a 31 overall pick to the number 8. So I think with Tet,
Yeah.
he's going to see a lot of the ball, and he's definitely got a lot of talent. So it'll be interesting. So I'm more of a push on Tet and a heavy buy on Travis.
Okay. I think I'm a push on both when you're talking about 2025 upside,
Hmm.
but I think my argument comes down to Ted McMillan is in the better target share situation because
Yep.
Travis Hunter has to compete with Brian Thomas Jr. But I think that I haven't voiced this one as much, but I think Trevor Lawrence is going to have a real big year for Jacksonville with Liam Cohen there, and now Brian Thomas Jr. and Travis Hunter getting getting the ball into those guys' hands. An improved offensive line, I think, should be an improved offensive line this year, and an improved scheme overall. So I'm giving the quarterback bump to Travis Hunter over Bryce Young, but I think, or excuse me, over Ted McMillan because Bryce Young, I think, while he looked really good in the end of last year, I think there's still a lot of concerns there for me. Um, and I don't have as many concerns about Lawrence because we've seen some of the flashes of what Lawrence can do, and that's top 10 quarterback stuff. Bryce Young, I don't think we've seen that even in the flashes yet necessarily. So I give the quarterback edge to Travis Hunter over Ted McMillan, but I give the target share option or bump to Tet over Hunter. So it's kind of I don't know where to go with either one of these. If I'm comparing the two, I'm probably going to go McMillan because of the opportunity over Hunter for 2025. But I think if I'm looking long term, I'm probably going to go Travis Hunter. Yeah, I'm probably taking Travis Hunter over Tet McMillan in dynasty drafts this year. So, but it's close. It's really close, in my opinion.
Yeah.
All right,
Enough.
let's do this. Let's go on to the tight end position, and there's not much at tight end, so we'll just wrap this up pretty quickly here. But um, we do need to talk about excuse me. We do need to talk about Evan Ingram going to Denver from Jacksonville. How do you feel about this one? This is an interesting one to me, and I think I've got a take on it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts first. What do you think about Evan Ingram going to Sean Payton in Denver? That scheme from where he was in Jacksonville.
Yeah. So I think for Evan Ingram, we've seen he's been relatively, if not really, productive in his last few years. And I think he's kind of grown
Yeah.
into that player that we saw come out of the draft and at the Giants that we kind of hoped to see. I think the move from Jacksonville to the Broncos is a good one. Once again, you're moving from a better coaching staff to what was in Jacksonville last year to
Yep.
Sean Payton, who's a Hall of Famer. I think the quick game that they're using to optimize Bo Nix will amplify kind of Evan Ingram's pass catching skills. He's going to see a lot of balls over the middle in quick game, 5, 6 yard catches. He's going to see a lot of them. So I think he definitely complements what the Broncos are trying to do. And obviously that's why they went out and got him.
Yep.
So yeah, that's kind of where I sit with Evan Ingram.
Yeah. So I like the fit. Um, but again, I'm downgrading the quarterback, and maybe I'm wrong for that, but you'd be hard pressed to convince me that going from Trevor Lawrence to Bo Nix, even though the schematics are probably better in Denver under Sean Payton, you'd be hard pressed to convince me that that's a better um, quarterback situation for
Mhm.
Evan Ingram. And the fact that he was so heavily targeted in that Jacksonville offense, I mean, he was their target leader for the last 3 years until he got hurt this last year. And Brian Thomas Jr. established himself as a wide receiver one as a rookie. So I don't know. This is a tough one for me. I'm probably gonna sell this as a better situation from my perspective. Although I can see the benefits. And also, I'll say this: I'm drafting Evan Ingram as a top 10 tight end this year, but that has more to do with the lack of good tight ends overall, I think, than he's in a better situation for me. So I think it's close, but I'm going to sell it as a better situation overall, even though I still like his prospects overall for 2025. When you look at the tight ends and you look at the top 10 or so, you got Brock Bowers, obviously, you got Trey McBride. George Kittle is number 3 right now. Sam Laporta is number 4. You got TJ Hawkinson, Evan Ingram, and Jonnu Smith in Miami before you even get to Travis Kelce. That's a changing of the guard, like just completely ahead of 2025. There's room here though for some risers, for some guys to step in and become big time tight ends, productive tight ends. Do either of the first round rookies fall into that category for you? Tyler Warren, Colson Loveland, they're being drafted as tight end 16 and tight end 18 respectively right now. Do either of those guys jump into the top 10 as rookies here?
I struggle to see it personally. I think Loveland's going to have a hard time seeing a lot of targets. I think there's a lot of weapons on the outside and a lot of mouths to feed there in Chicago now. And obviously they're going to be running the ball a lot, even if they don't have a superstar running back. They're still going to be running the ball a lot with Ben Johnson. So Loveland, I don't see him being a top 10. Obviously, he was taken relatively high. Was it 10th?
Yep.
Yeah, so had that high investment in him, but I think for 2025 he might be just a bit of, I might just leave him there, and then for the future is kind of where you'll see Loveland's production step up, maybe when DJ Moore moves on and he can kind of step into being a playmaker too in a way. And then Tyler Warren, I think with his skill set, he's slightly less of a pure pass catcher than Loveland, but I think he'll get the ball in more interesting ways. I think at Penn State they used him as a wildcat. I think he's a bit more of a yards after the catch threat. So probably just a better athlete. So it'll be interesting to see how they can get him the ball and how they move him around. But I think the Warriors, the quarterback situation there, Anthony Richardson hasn't shown much at all. Obviously, he's got the big arm and the athleticism, but he hasn't shown much to be anything of an NFL quarterback at this point from an efficiency standpoint and being able to run the game. And then on the other end, you got Daniel Jones, who was basically ushered out of New York as soon as that contract would let them.
Yeah.
So I think that quarterback situation is one of the worst in the league for any rookies and then just any players really.
Yeah. So I argue with the Tyler Warren situation a little bit because, and I'm not saying Tyler Warren is Brock Bowers, but Brock Bowers had nothing at quarterback last year, and he went off for the best tight end season we've ever seen. Tyler Warren just will not be denied. He's got that mentality very much like Brock Bowers does. I see mentality-wise that they're very similar. Play style-wise, they're very different, although Brock Bowers after the catch is already the best tight end in football. And then, Tyler Warren has a chance to be there pretty quickly as well. Tyler Warren's just not going to beat you down the field as much as Brock Bowers can. So where I'm less concerned about the quarterback situation there for Indianapolis is that I think dumping off to your Tyler Warren in the middle of the field, that might end up happening more if you have bad quarterback play. So maybe that works in his favor. I'm with you completely on Colson Loveland. Too many mouths to feed there. He's a rookie. You've got Cole Kmet at the same position already. It's a redundant skill set for a reason. Ben Johnson wanted 2 guys that he could put on the field at the same time who can catch the ball in 12 personnel between Loveland and Cole Kmet. So I don't think that he has a breakout rookie season, although Sam Laporta, we could have said the same about Sam Laporta a couple years ago in Detroit, and that turned out really good for Sam Laporta. So maybe I've got these flipped in the end, but I like Tyler Warren. I'm going to buy Tyler Warren this year, but I'm probably going to sell Colson Loveland from a situation standpoint. Just my perspective on those guys. Any other tight ends we should talk about? I really don't see any. I think we should watch a couple names. Kyle Pitts could be on the move. Jonas Smith could be on the move. Mark Andrews could end up being on the move too, potentially. But I don't know. I don't see any like change of location that would make me think that somebody's in a better spot or a worse spot more significantly. So anybody else you want to mention here in this conversation before we call it a night?
I think maybe just from a change of scenery for Jonnu Smith, I wouldn't be overly excited if I was a fantasy owner, just because he was used so much last year in Miami, and they used him as a gadget player in the kind of sense that he was. So obviously he's been linked to being traded to the Steelers and back to Arthur Smith, and obviously he was serviceable there, but from what we saw him in Miami, that's kind of how they optimized him, was using him as a gadget player and using his athleticism to optimize him. So I think if he moved away from Miami, there's a chance he wouldn't be able to produce the same level potentially. But that's just a quick insight.
Yeah, I kind of agree with that too. And we need as many guys in like the best role possible, workhorse type, high target share type roles at tight end as we can get. There's a few guys. We'll talk about some sleepers down the road here that I'm interested in seeing, and tight end specifically is one of those positions every year that's really intriguing to me. How do you attack it? What's your draft strategy for it? And who are the guys that in a soft upper echelon of tight ends, who are the guys who could jump into that conversation? So maybe we can discuss that another time, but I think it's fascinating to talk about the tight ends when it comes to fantasy. Archie, good stuff. That's going to do it for us here. What you got coming up on the SteelCurtainNetwork.com and Fans First Sports that we need to be keeping an eye out for?
Yeah, so I've got a series that I'm underway of comparing the Steelers 2024, 2025 rosters from a matchups perspective. I know we've done an overall kind of sentiment previously in the offseason, but just doing more of a head-to-head kind of projecting a depth chart. So I'm enjoying that. I've got defensive line done, and I think I'll start on quarterback next just because of the hot news coming out for the Steelers. And then from a fans first perspective, I'll begin writing on Chelsea Football Club, which is exciting. So I'm doing some articles there about the Premier League and obviously one of the biggest sports in the world that's definitely growing in America from what I assume and what I can see. So yeah,
I haven't hopped on board the Premier League train yet, but maybe someday. Maybe someday you'll get me there. But yeah, I'll have to check that out for sure. Good stuff from you as always. Follow him on X, Twitter at @AWills_Steelers. Follow me there as well at @TheBets93. We'll keep you up to date on all things fantasy, Pittsburgh Steelers, and some Premier League stuff from Archie Wilson there as well. So Archie, appreciate you. Hope you have a great evening and hope all the listeners have a great weekend. That's going to do it for us here on the Draft Dynasty Podcast. Keep drafting, everybody.